Starfleet never admits it writes off its own. The official narrative treats every lost vessel as a tragedy in progress, a crew still waiting for rescue, a name on a list that command will never stop searching for. The reality reflected in canon tells a different story. Ships that vanish beyond a certain threshold of distance, strategic value, or political cost are not rescued. They are mourned, catalogued, and replaced. The crews aboard those vessels are left to navigate a question Starfleet doctrine was never designed to answer. What happens when the system that legitimizes your authority, your mission, and your identity stops caring whether you survive? This is not about survival against hostile forces. It is about what happens to order when the institution that enforces it ceases to exist in any meaningful sense. Deep space loss does not kill crews quickly. It erodes them. It replaces Federation principles with improvised law. It turns captains into warlords, first officers into judges, and crew manifests into population registers. Over time, the ship stops being a Starfleet vessel and becomes something else entirely, a closed system where the rules are whatever keeps the hull pressurized and the people inside it from tearing each other apart. The misconception is that Starfleet's values are universal. Canon proves they are conditional. When a ship is lost, the first thing that dies is not hope, it is accountability. Starfleet operates as a centralized hierarchy where legitimacy flows downward from command. A captain's authority is not inherent. It is granted by Starfleet, reinforced by regular contact with the chain of command, and validated through adherence to regulations that assume the presence of oversight. The system works because ships are never truly alone. They operate within range of starbases, within subspace communication networks, within the political and logistical architecture of the Federation. Even deep space assignments assume eventual resupply, rotation of personnel, and the ability to escalate decisions upward when situations exceed local authority. Remove that infrastructure and the entire model collapses. A captain cut off from Starfleet command is no longer operating under delegated authority. They are operating under assumed authority, a far more fragile thing. The crew follows orders not because Starfleet says the captain is in charge, but because the alternative is chaos. That shift is subtle at first. The captain still wears the uniform. The crew still follows protocol. But the foundation beneath those rituals has changed. Authority is no longer institutional. It is personal, conditional, and entirely dependent on the captain's ability to maintain the illusion that the system still exists. On screen, we see this pattern repeat. Voyager is the most visible case, but it is not the only one. The Equinox, the Raven, the Enterprise in certain timelines all demonstrate the same fundamental problem. When contact is severed, captains are forced to make decisions that would, under normal circumstances, require approval from flag officers, the Federation Council, or treaty-bound third parties. They do not have that luxury. They make the call and live with the consequences, except there are no consequences. Not in the institutional sense. No court-martials, no board of inquiry, no admiralty review, just the next crisis and the one after that. The degradation is incremental, but it is also inevitable. Voyager's first major compromise comes early. The integration of Maquis personnel into the crew is framed as a gesture of unity, but it is functionally a necessity. Chakotay's people are not absorbed into Starfleet because Janeway believes in rehabilitation. They are absorbed because the ship cannot function with a divided crew 70,000 light-years from reinforcement. The decision is tactically sound, but it sets a precedent. Starfleet doctrine is negotiable when survival is at stake. The Maquis do not become Starfleet officers through training or formal enlistment. They are granted rank and authority by executive decree, a power Janeway does not technically possess under Federation law. No one objects because there is no one left to object to. The Equinox pushes the logic further. Captain Ransom begins with the same principles Janeway does, but his ship is smaller, his crew more fragile, his resources thinner. When he discovers that nucleogenic lifeforms can be converted into fuel, he does not report the finding to Starfleet science. He does not convene an ethical review. He makes a command decision and justifies it internally. The choice is monstrous, but it is also structurally predictable. Ransom is not accountable to Starfleet. He is accountable to his crew, and his crew wants to survive. The aliens he kills are not Federation citizens. They do not fall under treaty protection. They are obstacles, and in deep space, obstacles that cannot be negotiated with are eliminated. The horror is not that Ransom becomes a monster. The horror is that his logic is coherent within the framework he is operating under. Voyager's confrontation with the Equinox is not a moral victory. It is a reminder that Janeway's adherence to Starfleet principles is a choice, not a requirement. She could have made the same decisions Ransom did. She has the same isolation, the same desperation, the same lack of oversight. The only difference is temperament and the structural luck of a larger crew with more redundancy. Janeway frames her choices as loyalty to Federation values, but canon shows those values bending under pressure again and again. She violates the temporal prime directive. She negotiates with the Borg. She arms photon torpedoes that should have run out years ago. The rules apply until they do not, and no one is watching to say otherwise. The psychological erosion follows a predictable curve. In the first weeks after a ship is lost, the crew clings to routine. Duty shifts continue. Protocol is observed. The captain maintains the fiction that they are still operating under Starfleet authority, and the crew accepts it because the alternative is admitting they are on their own. This phase can last months if the captain is competent and the crew is disciplined. But it cannot last forever. The breaking point usually comes when a major decision is required. A Treaty of Algeron boundary is crossed because the shortest route home requires it. A sentient species is contacted in violation of the Prime Directive because they have technology the ship needs. A crew member is sentenced to confinement or execution without access to JAG review because there is no brig capacity for long-term detention and no extradition authority to transfer them elsewhere. These are not theoretical scenarios. Voyager faces every one of them. Each decision erodes the idea that Starfleet doctrine still governs the ship. The crew begins to understand that the rules are maintained not because they are universal, but because the captain chooses to maintain them. And if the captain can choose to maintain them, the captain can choose to discard them. Once that realization takes hold, authority becomes conditional. Chakotay's loyalty to Janeway is personal, not institutional. He does not follow her orders because Starfleet appointed her. He follows them because he respects her judgment and because open conflict would destroy the crew. Tuvok's adherence to protocol is philosophical, rooted in Vulcan logic rather than Starfleet regulation. B'Elanna Torres never fully internalizes Starfleet discipline at all. Her compliance is transactional. She works because the ship needs her skills, not because she believes in the chain of command. The crew holds together not because of shared institutional loyalty, but because the alternative is worse. Starfleet's abandonment of lost ships is not malicious. It is economic. The Federation operates across 8,000 light-years of territory with finite shipbuilding capacity, finite personnel, and finite political will to commit resources to uncertain outcomes. A ship lost in the Delta Quadrant is 70,000 light-years away. A rescue mission would take decades, even at maximum warp, assuming it was possible at all. The Dominion War, the Borg, the Romulans, all represent existential threats that require immediate resource allocation. A single lost ship, no matter how tragic, does not justify diverting a fleet. This calculation is never stated openly, but it is embedded in Starfleet's operational behavior. When Voyager is lost, Starfleet does not launch a rescue operation. They declare the crew missing and reassign their families. When the Equinox vanishes, it is logged as destroyed. When the Raven is lost in the Delta Quadrant, the Hansons are not pursued. They are mourned. The pattern is consistent. Ships that disappear beyond strategic retrieval range are written off. The implications are darker than the Federation admits. If a ship is considered irretrievable, the crew is legally in a state of limbo. They are not dead, so their dependents do not receive survivor benefits. They are not resigned, so their commissions remain technically active. They are not court-martialed, so their actions carry no institutional consequence. They exist in a gray zone where Starfleet authority is assumed but not enforced, and where their decisions are their own until they return, at which point they are subject to retroactive judgment. Voyager's return after 7 years forces Starfleet to confront this contradiction. Janeway made decisions that, under normal circumstances, would have ended her career. She collaborated with the Borg. She violated the temporal prime directive multiple times. She armed and deployed a Maquis insurgent as her second officer. She executed summary justice without access to Federation legal review. She crossed into Romulan, Klingon, and Borg space without authorization. Every one of these actions would, in isolation, justify a board of inquiry. None of them result in formal charges. Starfleet cannot prosecute Janeway without admitting that their doctrine is unenforceable in deep space. If they court-martial her, they validate the idea that captains in her position are expected to adhere to regulations designed for ships operating within Federation space, which is functionally impossible. If they exonerate her, they admit that Starfleet law is conditional and that captains beyond oversight are operating under a different standard. Either option undermines institutional legitimacy. The solution is to do nothing. Janeway is promoted. Her decisions are framed as heroic improvisation rather than violations. The contradictions are buried in classified reports and never examined in open court. The crew is rewarded for surviving, not for following the rules. This creates a dangerous precedent. If captains know they will not be held accountable for decisions made beyond communication range, the incentive to adhere to Federation principles weakens. The only reason to follow the Prime Directive in deep space is personal conviction. The only reason to refuse alliances with hostile powers is moral preference. The only reason to maintain crew discipline through lawful means is a belief that those means are worth preserving. If the captain does not share that belief, there is no mechanism to enforce it. Captain Ransom did not start as a war criminal. He started as a Starfleet officer with the same training, the same oaths, and the same institutional conditioning as Janeway. The difference is not moral character. The difference is that Ransom's ship was smaller, his margin for error thinner, and his psychological resilience lower. When the Equinox began to fail, he made a choice. He could let his crew die according to Starfleet principles, or he could abandon those principles and give them a chance. He chose survival. The nucleogenic life forms he killed were not Federation citizens. They were not protected under any treaty Starfleet had signed. They were, from his perspective, resources. Ransom did not see himself as a murderer. He saw himself as a captain doing what was necessary to bring his people home. His crew supported him not because they were monsters, but because the alternative was death. Every time they used the nucleogenic drive, they moved closer to Federation space. Every alien they killed bought them another few hundred light years. From their perspective, it worked. Janeway's moral outrage when she discovers what Ransom has done is genuine, but it is also situational. She has the luxury of that outrage because Voyager is larger, better supplied, and more resilient. Her crew has not reached the point where existential desperation overrides ethical reasoning. Ransom's crew has. The gap between them is not moral superiority, it is resource allocation and luck. Canon does not let Janeway off easily. Her pursuit of the Equinox becomes obsessive. She risks her own crew to punish Ransom, violates her own stated principles to extract revenge, and alienates Chakotay in the process. The episode ends with Ransom's death and the integration of his surviving crew into Voyager, but the deeper question is never answered. If Voyager had been the smaller ship, if Janeway had faced the same resource scarcity, would she have made different choices? The episode implies she might have. The institutional refusal to prepare captains for deep space loss is deliberate. Starfleet trains officers to operate within a framework of oversight, regulation, and logistical support. The assumption is that those structures will always be available. Captains are taught to escalate difficult decisions, to rely on specialized personnel, to follow established protocols. They are not trained to function as autonomous political entities because Starfleet does not want them to. A captain who is trained to operate independently is a captain who does not need Starfleet. This is not paranoia, it is institutional design. The Federation's power rests on the idea that its member worlds and its Starfleet officers share a common framework of laws, values, and accountability. If captains in deep space begin making their own treaties, their own laws, their own definitions of justice, the Federation fragments. Each lost ship becomes a microstate, a sovereign entity operating under its own rules. When those ships return, if they return, they bring those rules back with them. Voyager's crew does not fully reintegrate into Starfleet culture. They cannot. 7 years of isolation has changed them. They have seen things Federation citizens have not seen. They have made compromises Federation law does not acknowledge. They have become something other than Starfleet officers, and Starfleet has no framework for what that something is. The Federation absorbs them anyway because the alternative is worse. There is a pattern in how deep space isolation reshapes crew identity. In the first year, the crew defines itself in opposition to their situation. They are Starfleet officers temporarily separated from the Federation. Their goal is return. Their identity is unchanged. In the second and third years, the definition softens. They are still Starfleet, but the immediacy of that identity fades. They stop thinking in terms of regulations and start thinking in terms of survival. By year 5, the shift is complete. They are no longer Starfleet officers trying to get home. They are the crew of a specific ship, loyal to each other and to their captain, with Starfleet as a distant memory rather than a present reality. Voyager never fully crosses that threshold because Janeway refuses to let it. She maintains the rituals, the uniforms, the rank structure, the adherence to protocol, even when it is inefficient. She does this not because it is tactically optimal, but because she understands that once the crew stops thinking of themselves as Starfleet, they will never be Starfleet again. Other ships are not so lucky. The Raven was a small science vessel crewed by 2 exobiologists and their daughter. When they were assimilated by the Borg, they were not operating under Starfleet oversight. They had crossed into the Delta Quadrant on a long-term research mission with minimal support and no expectation of regular contact. The decision to pursue the Borg was theirs alone. No admiral approved it. No board of inquiry reviewed the risks. The Hansons made a command decision to expose themselves and their child to one of the most dangerous species in known space because they believed the scientific value justified it. Starfleet did not stop them because Starfleet was not watching. When the Raven was destroyed and the Hansons assimilated, Starfleet did not mount a rescue operation. They were declared lost. 7 of 9 spent 18 years as a Borg drone before Voyager severed her from the collective. In that time, Starfleet did nothing. Not because they were callous, but because there was nothing they could do. The Borg are not a force that can be negotiated with. The Delta Quadrant is not a region Starfleet can project power into. The Hansons were written off the moment they vanished. The deeper implication is that Starfleet allowed the mission in the first place. They gave a small civilian ship permission to pursue the Borg into uncharted space with no support, no backup, and no realistic extraction plan. That decision reflects a calculated tolerance for loss. The Hansons were valuable, but not irreplaceable. The data they might gather was worth the risk of losing them. This is not cruelty, it is strategic calculus. Starfleet operates at a scale where individual lives are variables in larger equations. A ship lost in deep space is tragic, but it is also statistically predictable. Every year, a certain percentage of vessels will fail to return. Some are destroyed in combat, some are lost to spatial anomalies, some simply vanish without explanation. The acceptable loss rate is never stated openly, but it is embedded in Starfleet's resource allocation. They build ships, expecting some will not come back. The crews aboard those ships are briefed on risks, but they are not told the truth. They are not told that if they cross a certain threshold of distance or strategic irrelevance, they are on their own. They are told that Starfleet will do everything possible to bring them home, which is technically true. Starfleet will do everything possible within the constraints of available resources, political priorities, and competing existential threats. Possible does not mean guaranteed. Voyager's return after 7 years is an outlier, not a precedent. They survived because they had a skilled crew, a resilient ship, and an unbroken chain of command. They made alliances. They adapted. They endured. But for every Voyager, there are a dozen ships that did not return. The Equinox barely limped back. The Raven never did. The USS Bratin, the USS Hera, the USS Pegasus, all represent cases where isolation, whether spatial or political, led to catastrophic failure. The question is not whether Starfleet could have saved them. The question is whether Starfleet tried. On screen, the answer is no. When the Enterprise discovers the USS Pegasus embedded in an asteroid, the ship has been missing for 12 years. No rescue mission was launched. No follow-up investigation was conducted. The ship was declared lost and the incident classified. The only reason it is found at all is because Pressman, the former captain, manipulates Picard into returning to the site. The truth is that Starfleet covered up the Pegasus to bury evidence of illegal weapons research. The crew that mutinied against Pressman were not traitors. They were officers trying to stop a treaty violation. Starfleet suppressed the mutiny, classified the ship, and left the wreckage hidden. The institutional priority was not accountability. It was containment. This is the calculus that governs deep space loss. If a ship disappears in a way that threatens Federation interests, Starfleet intervenes. If the loss is strategically irrelevant or politically inconvenient, they do not. The crews aboard those ships are expendable not because Starfleet does not value them, but because the larger system cannot afford to prioritize individual lives over collective stability. It is not malice, it is the logic of scale. The psychological toll on captains operating under this reality is severe. They are expected to maintain morale, enforce discipline, and uphold Federation values while knowing that the institution they represent has abandoned them. This creates a cognitive dissonance that cannot be resolved through doctrine. Either the captain internalizes the idea that they are truly alone and begins making decisions based on that reality, or they maintain the fiction that Starfleet still matters and risk losing the respect of a crew that knows better. Janeway chooses the latter. She performs Starfleet loyalty as a deliberate strategy, not because she believes rescue is imminent, but because the alternative is admitting that the mission has failed. If the crew accepts that Starfleet is gone, they will stop behaving like Starfleet officers. Janeway cannot allow that, because once the identity breaks, the ship becomes ungovernable. Chakotay understands this. His role as first officer is not to enforce regulations. It is to reinforce Janeway's authority by validating her decisions in front of the crew. When he disagrees with her, he does so privately. When he supports her, he does so visibly. The performance is intentional. The crew needs to believe that the command structure is stable, even when it is not. Tuvok provides a different kind of support. His adherence to logic allows him to justify Janeway's decisions in terms that do not require emotional investment. When she violates the Prime Directive, he frames it as the most logical course of action given available variables. When she risks the ship to pursue the Equinox, he does not question her judgment. He calculates the probabilities and presents them without moral commentary. This creates the illusion that her choices are rational, even when they are driven by anger or desperation. The rest of the crew follows because the alternative is chaos. But the performance only works as long as the captain remains competent. If Janeway makes a catastrophic mistake, if she loses a significant portion of the crew through bad judgment, the illusion collapses. The crew will stop following her not because they reject Starfleet, but because they no longer believe she can keep them alive. At that point, authority transfers to whoever the crew trusts more, and the chain of command fractures. Voyager never reaches that point, but it comes close. The Year of Hell timeline shows what happens when the ship is pushed past its breaking point. Chakotay relieves Janeway of command not because she is incompetent, but because she is too damaged to function. Her insistence on restoring the timeline has become obsessive. Her refusal to abandon ship has become suicidal. Chakotay's decision to remove her is not mutiny. It is triage. In the reset timeline, none of it happens, but the potential remains. The deeper structural problem is that Starfleet has no doctrine for deep space command succession. If a captain dies or becomes incapacitated, the first officer assumes command. But what happens if the first officer also dies? What if the entire senior staff is killed? Starfleet regulations assume that a replacement crew can be brought in from a nearby starbase or that the ship can return to Federation space for reassignment. In deep space, neither option exists. Voyager's crew is small enough that a single catastrophic event could wipe out the entire command structure. If Janeway, Chakotay, and Tuvok were all killed in the same engagement, who takes command? B'Elanna Torres is the next most senior officer, but she is an engineer, not a command track officer. Tom Paris has command experience, but he was dishonorably discharged and only reinstated under duress. Harry Kim is competent but lacks the seniority or the respect of the crew. There is no clear answer, because Starfleet never designed the system to function without institutional support. In practice, the crew would probably follow whoever kept them alive. Rank would matter less than competence. Loyalty would transfer to whoever could maintain order and make the hard calls. This is not Starfleet doctrine, this is warlordism, but in deep space, the distinction disappears. The same logic applies to law enforcement. Tuvok functions as Voyager's security chief, but he is also the ship's only real law enforcement presence. There is no external judiciary, no JAG officers, no independent review. When he arrests someone, they are confined to quarters or the brig based on his judgment and Janeway's approval. When someone is accused of a crime, there is no trial by jury. There is a hearing presided over by the captain, with no right to appeal and no external oversight. This is not justice, it is expedience. The Maquis integration makes this problem worse. Several of Voyager's crew are former insurgents who were never formally tried or convicted. They were absorbed into Starfleet by executive decree, their crimes pardoned implicitly rather than explicitly. This creates a legal gray zone where some crew members are operating under Starfleet authority despite having no legitimate claim to it. Chakotay is the most visible example. He was a Starfleet officer who resigned to join the Maquis, making him a deserter and an insurgent. His actions during the Maquis conflict included attacking Cardassian military and civilian targets, smuggling, and engaging in armed resistance against Federation policy. Under normal circumstances, he would face court-martial and imprisonment. Instead, he is made first officer of a Starfleet vessel with full authority over the crew. Janeway does not have the legal authority to grant him that rank. She does it anyway because the ship cannot function without him. B'Elanna Torres is in a similar position. She was expelled from Starfleet Academy and later joined the Maquis as an engineer. Her integration into Voyager's crew makes her chief engineer, a senior staff position that would normally require years of service and formal qualification. She receives the rank based on skill, not protocol. The rest of the Maquis crew are assigned to various departments without formal enlistment, without background checks, and without the oversight that would normally accompany integrating former insurgents into a military hierarchy. It works because Voyager is isolated and because Chakotay enforces discipline among his people. But the precedent is dangerous. If Voyager had encountered a Federation starbase in the first year, the Maquis crew would have been arrested. Chakotay would have faced charges. Torres would have been discharged. The entire integration would have been dismantled. The only reason it survives is because Starfleet is not present to stop it. This reveals a deeper truth about Federation law. It is not universal. It is enforced selectively based on proximity to power. In Federation space, the law applies because there are institutions to enforce it. In deep space, the law is whatever the captain says it is. Janeway enforces Starfleet regulations not because they are binding, but because she chooses to. If she decided tomorrow that the Prime Directive no longer applied, there would be no mechanism to stop her. The crew would follow her lead because they have no alternative frame of reference. Over time, the new normal would become normal, and the old rules would fade into memory. This is not hypothetical. It is what happened to the Equinox. Ransom's crew stopped seeing the Prime Directive as binding because Ransom stopped enforcing it. Once the first exception was made, the second was easier. Once the nucleogenic lifeforms were categorized as resources rather than sentient beings, the moral framework collapsed. The crew did not rebel because the alternative was death, and because Ransom maintained enough internal discipline to prevent fracture. The ship became a closed moral system where the only law was survival. Voyager avoids this outcome not because Janeway is morally superior, but because she has the resources and the crew stability to maintain the fiction of Starfleet governance. If those conditions changed, her choices would change with them. The contamination risk is real. When Voyager finally returns to Federation space, the crew brings back 7 years of improvised law, improvised ethics, and improvised command structure. They have seen allies the Federation has never contacted. They have made treaties Starfleet never authorized. They have crossed borders the Federation considers inviolable. They have killed in self-defense without oversight. They have assimilated Borg technology in ways that violate a dozen treaties. Starfleet cannot simply reintegrate them as if nothing happened, but they do. The official position is that Voyager's crew acted heroically under impossible circumstances and that their actions, while irregular, were justified by the extremity of their situation. This is a political decision, not a legal one. Starfleet chooses not to prosecute because doing so would force them to articulate a clear standard for deep space conduct, and that standard does not exist. If they court-martial Janeway for violating the Temporal Prime Directive, they must also court-martial every other captain who has made similar calls in isolation. If they prosecute her for collaborating with the Borg, they must explain why that collaboration was unacceptable when it saved her crew and brought them home. If they charge her for integrating the Maquis without authorization, they must explain what the alternative should have been. There is no good answer to any of these questions. So Starfleet does what institutions always do when faced with contradictions they cannot resolve. They declare victory, promote the survivors, and bury the precedent in classified files. The cost of this decision is that the next captain in Voyager's position will have no guidance. They will know that Janeway survived by bending the rules, but they will not know which rules can be bent and which cannot. They will not know whether they will be rewarded or court-martialed when they return. They will make their choices in a fog of institutional ambiguity, with no clear sense of what Starfleet expects from them. This is not an accident, it is policy. Starfleet benefits from leaving the question unresolved. If captains in deep space believe they might face prosecution, they will be more cautious. If they believe they will be exonerated, they will be more reckless. By refusing to articulate a standard, Starfleet preserves maximum flexibility to judge each case individually based on political convenience rather than legal principle. The result is a system where captains are held accountable not for what they do, but for whether it becomes politically inconvenient. This is visible in how Starfleet treats the Pegasus incident versus how they treat Voyager. Pressman's illegal weapons research threatens the Treaty of Algeron and could restart a war with the Romulans. His actions are buried, his career ended quietly, and the mutiny suppressed. Janeway's violations are less politically dangerous because they occurred 70,000 light-years away and involved species the Federation has no treaties with. Her actions are celebrated because they do not threaten existing power structures. The lesson is clear. Starfleet's values are negotiable when enforcement is politically costly. The same logic applies to how the Federation treats lost colonies. The treaty with Cardassia cedes several Federation colonies to Cardassian control, and the colonists are expected to accept Cardassian governance or evacuate. Many refuse. They form the Maquis and begin an insurgency. Starfleet's response is to declare the Maquis terrorists and hunt them down, not because their grievances are invalid, but because their existence threatens the treaty. The colonists are sacrificed to preserve the larger political structure. This is the same calculation applied to lost ships. If a vessel disappears in a way that threatens Federation stability, Starfleet intervenes. If the loss is contained and does not create political fallout, they do not. The crew is mourned, but not rescued. Voyager's survival is an anomaly that Starfleet is forced to accommodate, not a precedent they are prepared to honor. The mechanism underlying all of this is simple. Starfleet's authority is not universal. It is localized. It exists where Starfleet can project power, enforce law, and maintain institutional presence. Beyond that threshold, Starfleet's values are suggestions, not commandments. Captains in deep space are free to follow them or discard them based on their own judgment, and Starfleet will judge the results retroactively based on political convenience. This creates a system where the Federation's principles are strongest where they are least tested and weakest where they are most needed. In deep space, the Federation does not exist. Only the ship does, and the ship is whatever the captain makes it. The long-term consequence of this system is that Starfleet cannot scale its values beyond its infrastructure. Every attempt to expand Federation influence into regions where enforcement is impossible results in the same pattern. Ships are sent, contact is lost, decisions are made in isolation. When contact is restored, the decisions are rationalized or suppressed depending on political cost. The Federation presents itself as a post-scarcity utopia built on universal principles, but canon reveals it as a hierarchical state that enforces its values selectively. The deeper into space you go, the thinner those values become, until all that remains is the shell of Starfleet protocol wrapped around the reality of survival. Janeway maintains that shell longer than most. She refuses to let her crew forget who they are, even when remembering is painful. She enforces the rituals because she knows that once they stop performing Starfleet, they will stop being Starfleet. But the performance only lasts as long as she does. If she dies, if she breaks, if she makes one catastrophic error that loses the crew's trust, the entire structure collapses. And when it does, no one is coming to save them. Starfleet does not write off its ships out of cruelty. It writes them off because the alternative is unsustainable. A rescue mission to the Delta Quadrant would take decades and cost resources that are needed elsewhere. The Borg are an existential threat. The Dominion is an existential threat. The Romulans, the Klingons, the Cardassians all represent strategic priorities that cannot be deferred to rescue a single lost vessel. The calculus is brutal, but it is also rational. The problem is that Starfleet never admits this calculus exists. They tell crews that they will do everything possible to bring them home, and they mean it in the sense that they will exhaust all practical options. But practical options do not include sacrificing strategic position, political stability, or the defense of core Federation worlds. A ship lost beyond retrieval is mourned, catalogued, and replaced. The crew is honored, their families are supported, but they are not rescued. Voyager returns not because Starfleet rescued them, but because they rescued themselves. They crossed 70,000 light-years through hostile territory, made alliances with enemies, violated treaties, bent every rule Starfleet ever taught them, and survived. Starfleet rewards them for it because the alternative is admitting that their survival had nothing to do with Federation principles and everything to do with Janeway's willingness to discard those principles when necessary. The deeper truth is that Starfleet's values are resilient only when they are protected by Starfleet's power. Remove that protection and the values collapse under the weight of necessity. The Prime Directive is a luxury afforded to ships operating within range of support. The chain of command is legitimate only when it is backed by institutional oversight. Federation law is enforceable only when there are courts to enforce it. In deep space, none of those conditions exist. What remains is a captain, a crew, and a ship. The Federation is a memory. Starfleet is a uniform. The values are whatever the captain says they are, and the crew follows because the alternative is chaos. Janeway understands this. She performs Starfleet loyalty because it is the only thing holding the crew together. She enforces regulations because without them, the ship becomes a dictatorship. She maintains contact with Earth even when the messages take years to arrive because the crew needs to believe that home still exists. But she also knows the truth. Starfleet abandoned them the moment they disappeared. The rest is theater. And theater only works as long as everyone agrees to pretend. The final implication is that the Federation's survival depends on never testing its principles too far from home. Every deep space mission is a gamble that the crew will maintain Federation values in the absence of Federation power. Most of the time, it works. The crew returns. The values hold. The mission is declared a success. But when it fails, when a ship is lost, and the crew is forced to choose between survival and principle, the choice is always survival. The principles are discarded. The crew becomes something else. And if they return, Starfleet has to decide whether to honor them for surviving or prosecute them for what they did to survive. Starfleet chooses based on political cost, not moral principle. Voyager is honored because their violations are distant, contained, and do not threaten existing power structures. The Maquis integration is accepted because the alternative is admitting that Janeway exceeded her authority. Janeway's temporal violations are buried because prosecuting them would require Starfleet to articulate a coherent policy on causality, and they do not have one. The system works because it is flexible. It absorbs contradictions. It rationalizes failures. It declares victory even when the outcome is ambiguous. But it only works because the Federation is large enough to absorb the cost of individual failures. A single lost ship does not threaten the whole. A captain who goes rogue in deep space is a tragedy, not a systemic crisis. The danger is when the pattern scales, if multiple ships are lost, if multiple captains begin making independent decisions, if the frontier expands faster than Starfleet can project power to enforce its values. At that point, the Federation fragments. Each ship becomes a sovereign entity. Each captain becomes a warlord. The dream of a unified Federation collapses into a patchwork of independent fiefdoms held together by nostalgia and nothing else. Voyager is a test case for whether Federation values can survive isolation. The answer is conditional. They survive if the captain is competent, the crew is loyal, and the ship has enough resources to avoid existential desperation. Remove any one of those variables and the outcome changes. Ransom's crew did not fail because they were morally inferior. They failed because they lacked the structural resilience to maintain Federation principles under pressure. Voyager survived because they had that resilience, but it was a near thing. The real question is not what happens when a ship is lost. The real question is whether Starfleet's values are worth maintaining when no one is watching. Janeway says yes. Ransom says no. Starfleet refuses to choose. And in that refusal, the truth is revealed. Federation principles are not universal. They are not resilient. They are conditional luxuries dependent on proximity to power, and when that power disappears, so do the principles. In deep space, Starfleet does not govern. The captain does. And the captain governs not by law, but by will.